Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another philosophy talk on Confucius, Confucianism, and specifically Sun Tzu. Not Sun Tzu, the Chinese military strategist, but Sun Tzu, with a little at the beginning of sun. So it is Z-U-N, X-U-N-Z-I, Master Sun, which is sort of a bit of a pause right before the S. Again, if you say, and I would if you would listen to me speak fast, I am trying to fake it, but just saying Sun Tzu in English would effectively count both ways. You know, that Sun Tzu and Sun Tzu are pretty much identically pronounced for an English speaker who is not hearing the slight Chinese tones, etc., and consonants. So, with all of that, and me not pretending to fake nor make what have yous, Sun Tzu, in the older Wade Giles Sun Tzu, with a space between Sun and Tzu, and now it is Sun X-U-N, no space, Z-I, still pronounced Z, like a Tzu, but it's Z, it looks like Z. You could be like Xunzi, like it is Sun Tzu, it's got an at the end. Again, I just think trying to pronounce it a bit, not entirely authentically, but just a bit, is nice. Of course, and it is always an up in the air with all that, but, meeting middle ways here is good. As much as one can. The third is, Sun Tzu is the third most important Confucian after Confucius and Mencius. I've done a couple on Confucius and one on Mencius now. And then we're going to have the Neo-Confucians, Xunzi and Wang Yangming. And we're going to mix in the Cheng brothers, who we know a bit about, a tiny bit, in with Xunzi. So that will then finish out pretty much the Confucians. And this playlist on Confucians, as well as then added into for the ethics and East Asian classes. So, Sun Tzu studied and taught at a university in the state of Qi. And so he would have studied and learned a bit about Confucius as well as the theories of Mencius. It is unclear entirely, of course, given lack of records, etc., entirely what's going on with who read what when. But like Confucius and Mencius, he briefly held, Sun Tzu, a government position until his patron was assassinated, then returned to teaching. Intrigue. Scandinavia. He had many followers in his day, some of whom are said to have used his teachings in the service of legalism. He does sound like a we're all wolf girl. She's sexual, she's violent, she's wolf girl. It's very Freud. I'm going to get to bring up Freud and peeing fire out, which is one of my favorite. I had to read Civilization and its Discontent. I get to tell people occasionally about Freud's 2-page footnote about peeing fire out and how men start civilization, which is amazing, and it's a kind of a little bit too fluid. Hydrodynamic model of Freud's and the way that he thinks, and human beings think often, that actually is how men start civilization, and also how we're sexual, we're violent, we're wolf girl. And yes, a bit more misogynistically than that, as I like to joke about. But we're going to talk about Freud and a bit about where civilization comes from, a little bit with Sun Tzu. So we will talk about, very briefly, without any graphics, I'm going to show you, about peeing fire out and whether or not that has to do with being civilized or not. And we will speak of these things hilariously. Sun Tzu does not. He has more tact than me, and certainly Freud. So, with all of that, Sun Tzu is a legalist. He thinks that human beings are somewhat evil. Human nature is evil, is very much the Sun Tzu thesis. You got to transmute it to make it good. So he sounds like a legalist and not so loving like a Confucian, who are more conservative and limited in loving than the Moists, as we already studied here. And we have not yet gotten to Mo. Actually, I do need to do Mo's at least one video on Beyond the Confucians. I may even include the Moza videos in the Confucian playlist, because oddly enough, Moza is very important for discussing the backs and forths of Confucianism, though technically including Moza as a Confucian is not really all that legal, man, because he technically is going beyond it to more towards the communism. So Sun Tzu is both, essentially, at a time when people aren't applying the names in their day that they would apply just afterwards, as is often true in human thought, religion, philosophy, culture. He is both a legalist and a Confucian, and you can argue that he is and isn't a legalist and a Confucian. He got to be a Confucian, which is why he wasn't ditched with Han Fei and the legalists, which were upheld by the Qin and then not the Han. So he gets upheld by the Han, even though he is very much a legalist. That is an interesting thing going on here in his thinking. That's what makes him much more Freud. Human nature is evil, and actually that is also, as I have already said, why Confucius and Mencius are Latinized by Jesuits, but Xunzi is not Suncius. He would have been, but he isn't. I am very tempted, given the last few talks, to start calling him Suncius, or name my son, my firstborn son, Suncius, and then tell him all of us are Wolf Girl, we're all evil, and I just ditched the sailor suit last week, because of course screwing with your children, and my non-existent children, is the finest wines of life. So, dad jokes aside, pre-dad, and proto-Confucian and post-legalism, we're going to talk here a little bit about how Xunzi is into how we're all kind of wolf girl. We need to rein that in and transmute the inner wolf girl into society, morals, and goodness, because he is not so much we're loving children as much as Mencius. I have just given the Mencius talk, please see that, where Mencius says we should be like the little child, a la Jesus, and he talks about sowing barley on various ground like Jesus, and the Jesuits noticed that, Latinized Mencius's name is Mencius in the 1600s. Possibly or late 1500s. And Xunzi says, have you hung out with children, Mencius? Like, you're an idiot. And so are children, because you need education and development, and we're all evil wolf girl originally. Which is really fun stuff to cover. I don't actually agree entirely with Mencius or Xunzi, and Confucians kept these as two sides of the coin, as I have already mentioned in the beginning of talks on Confucianism, that Confucians have definitely seen Mencius and Xunzi, Suncius for me, and now for you, that Mencius and Xunzi, I won't be confusing on purpose, not any more so than I clearly need to be. Mencius and Xunzi are the good side, bad side of human nature. Human nature is good for Mencius, human nature is evil for Xunzi, and we both agree we need society to develop us, grow us, and rein us in. So they're all kind of conservative dad. But in the balancing back and forth, and again, I think Confucius is a outright genius at reversals of internal-external attribution and perspective, as I've already argued in those videos. That given all of that he is conservative dad who wants you to see both sides of the coin, man, and grow your mind and perspective, both, and have all this in balance, you very much have issues here where we're good or bad, given how cynical Confucius is of humanity. Says he's never met a perfect person, twice feels the need to mention, a la Freud, he's never met anybody who likes school as much as sex, in two different chapters, which, again, is weird. It's almost like a joke, but I'm bringing it's like a callback in the text, weirdly, like a lot of things in Confucius that seem like jokes for somebody who has been called a stuffed shirt by a few, and a feudal supporter, a feudalist, I suppose. Are there feudalists nowadays, I guess, in this economy? So, unlike Confucius and Mencius, Xunzi very much is emphasizing human nature is evil. He did not travel widely. Also, his text is his own, very differently, and cool. Analects and Mencius are clearly not their own writings, but whether or not they wrote things of the Book of Odes and Rites, that they, as I talked about with Confucius, that Xunzi is writing his own text, and he is saying Mencius is wrong, here are my arguments. He also, at the end of the text, I have to say, near the end of one of the books, if not the end of the whole text, as I have it, he gives a position about what could effectively be as I will get to, and glanced over the notes just before this, he gives a position very cynically about what we should have a very restrictive scientific method of understanding anything. We should be very cynical and critical. And when I say the scientific method, that is because I like Feyerabend. The scientific method is whatever works, and human beings at their smartest know to be critical and cynical of things. Sun says, like, be critical of everything. Here's how to lay things out such that you're only stating what's the facts and what's the case. And that just sounds like a smart person, and again, I am advocating a lot. You should trust and distrust science in its modern form, because the scientific method is human all too human. Please, again, don't go off your meds or off, and please vaccinate. All of that, please wear a mask. As with all of that stuff, we should look at culture cynically and say it's human all too human. I'm very Nietzschean. So Xunzi, basically, and he would have you wear a mask, stay indoors. He's a rather prickly pear. But yes, and he would have you reined in by the state most fiercely with the masks and everything, honestly. He would enforce, a lot of this stuff. Much more hardcore than, I don't know, even California out here. But basically, Xunzi would say that people are somewhat evil, we have to rein them in, and it is his own text. Not necessarily for the first time in China at all, but it is his own text. The Xunzi, which I love, talks about Xunzi and then talks about a bunch of other sages. Here's Joe of the North Sea. Who the heck is that? And then there's a bunch of people all thrown into the text saying a bunch of things. Analects of Confucius says a bunch of things and interacts with people. Mencius says a bunch of things, interacts with Yi and other people. In Sun Tzu is his essays, where we have, and there's two kinds of texts here, obviously, sort of collected analect stories of these major moments, written by people that are kind of oftentimes not in systemic in ways that we have to somewhat like put them back and forth to see themes or make arguments at all about the text. But Sun Tzu is sitting there arguing in essays about how he thinks Mencius is wrong. He's writing good philosophy essays for his time, I must say, as someone who grades people's philosophy essays. And he's arguing, and then he says, human nature is evil. There, I've gone through it. Basically, you have to reason what's in accord with the facts. An example, Mencius doesn't, I do, therefore Mencius is wrong. And easily, of course, I can wow students with that, and they're like, wow, how did people have such white scientific reasoning so long ago? Because it's human reasoning. You think they built pyramids by not being critical of stacks of stones, etc. No, there's a lot of scholarship. There's a lot of text, work, time that goes into building pyramids, and a lot of people don't tell you everything they know as the master class in engineering, most secret and sacred. But at the same time, of course, human beings have been like, okay, wait a minute here. And they can argue or not, given the power structures, religion, practices, institutions. Again, a lot of times genius scientists have to argue they're not idiots to the whole scientific community because we are distrustful, wolf girl, crazy beasts. So essentially, that is my opening rant about Sun Tzu, how he says you really need to be brute and scientific and cynical, and then he also says, so Mencius is wrong, we're all wolf girl, very Freud, good night everybody. And that's why we need society to be hard and a bit legalistic and rein us in with punishment, because we're terrible. Which, of course, is fun, happy, yippee-skippy times, like German pessimism, and it's a bunch of fun to talk about. Sun Tzu argued that human nature is evil, because human nature is desire. Now notice, in fact, the Confucians very much argue human nature is love. Now, that's very dualistic. I have been enjoying The Blackcoat's Daughter as a film and overanalyzing the heck out of that. That is very much a movie about how sexuality and desire and emotions are dualistic for men and women and male-female roles. I won't get all into that right now, but that gets into Freud and a lot of other weird stuff. I think the filmmaker's a little bit psychoanalytic, but you can get all behavioristic about it, and I love that film. But with all of that stuff, think about the dualistic role about how desire and emotion are both good and evil. So love, feeling things for others, oh, it's so much good. Yes, it is, and you can say all of that while also, wow, we really need to rein in desire and reform it and transform it, as Confucius and Mencius clearly say. And then Sun Tzu comes along and says, because desire is bad and childlike id originally. It's very Freud. Freud was apparently, much loved, not the greatest parent, it is said. He also did anecdotally get a lot of stuff from his kids, as did Piaget, and I love Piaget. I think he's amazing. A lot of his work still seems valid plenty. Most of those works haven't been discredited yet. So actually, again, this is powerful psychology. It's also about, is desire good or bad? Well, it's both. But do we transform it to be good out of the bad, or is it good originally and then it also can go wrong and bad? These are intriguing things to think about, and especially Freud is trying to hydrodynamic model these sorts of things in very similar ways. And I haven't even gotten to Freud in my German talk thoughts. I am getting there ever so slowly. This does remind me I need to give a short German philosophy talk on Freud before getting into the French, and I should do it in that order, I remind myself. But again, human nature from the evil side, and that we have to rein in the child and transform the child. That is very Freud versus Piaget, who has a much more positive, well, the children are kind of brilliant all from the get-go, whereas for Freud, they really have to be reined in specifically. Yes. So common to human thought across all cultures is the frame of desire and hate as the lower selfish part of our nature, and reason and love as the higher compassionate part of our nature. While Mencius argues that we naturally are upper, and it is merely obstructed by the lower when we are evil, Sun Tzu argues that we naturally are the lower, and it is only through cultivation that we develop compassion, are either singularly human nature, or the nature of cats. Again, leaping all around. Regardless, there is a common theme that we only come to be fulfilled in the way desire tries through developing reason and love through practice, which truly satisfy. You can say that Confucianism is very much teaching you two sides of that same coin, but they're very different sides here, as presented by Sun Tzu. He says, Mencius, mensa, master men, is wrong by name, which is a very powerful thing to do if you are, well, he's at a time when Mencius is not established as Mencius by Xunzi, a well over, 1,000, 1,300 years later at least. So like Mencius, Sun Tzu argued that anyone in the street can become a sage. Now that's quite beautiful. Any wolf girl out there can become a Yao or a Shun. That's amazing. That's great. Confucius definitely says that. That is keeping in line with Confucius saying anybody can become a Yao or a Shun. But it depends on environment and effort. Notice the barley parable, although he's going to flip that inside out a bit. Like Jesus, Mencius says sowing barley on various ground, sow it in a bad environment, going to be screwed up. Sun Tzu says twice, he repeats at the very end of the work, environment is the important thing, environment is the important thing. That means sort of like left-wing, John Dewey as the American pragmatist kind of stands for everything that's very pro-left-wing education. It's like, well, shower kind of the resources and the education and the rich environment on the child, nourish, and the nature. And very much Mencius and Sun Tzu would agree. Providing massive education and resources would be the help and the good environment. But of course, they disagree very much because Mencius thinks it's a beautiful, wonderful life and child, whereas Sun Tzu thinks this is wolf girl, that eventually the culture reforms and transmutes into wonderful sage person, eventually sage emperor king equivalent, anyone. But who puts in that kind of effort? Well, nobody, according to all these folks, because we're all a bunch of jerks. So if one hangs out with foolish people, one will be foolish. And likewise, if you stick to the wise and read the wisdom of great books, Sun Tzu argues, you will become wise. While we are not originally good, according to Sun Tzu, we have the capacity to become good even when it does not yet exist. And this is a tricky part he will get to. Much like Mencius's barley sowing analogy, but distinct, Sun Tzu would see the seed sowed not as the original heart that's good as the barley and the grain and the potential and the nature, but as external education and civilization sowed into good or bad positions of hearts. So he kind of makes the place the heart and the education the pure good seed outside. So the barley goes from being the pure heart already in you to being the power of the education being good, and the good parenting and the good teaching is the seed itself coming from outside of you. So he flips the same metaphor a bit inside out, and yet in some ways keeps it identical in the course of its development. So Sun Tzu argues he is very much, again, like Freud, also like Hobbes, for whom the cartoon tiger is named a la Calvin, the more fiery preacher boy. That Sun Tzu argues that without society and laws, very Hobbes in the 1500s in Britain, people would grab for themselves and do nothing for others. Sun Tzu argues that this justifies the king acting, as Hobbes argues, any way the king sees fit, including killing the subjects, in the name of the good and the safety of the entire people. As I do argue, sadly, with a multicultural classroom, of course, all too often, without commenting further, the cops get to have qualified immunity and basically be a bit Murder Incorporated, which is just the people who get to kill people, and then they kind of get to escape the law. Why? Well, unfortunately, the only best argument there would be for that would be kind of what, and I don't agree with it entirely, and I leave that right there, what Hobbes and others say. Why would the police, again, love the Simpsons joke, where Homer decides to start a militia to keep the town safe as the police force kind of collapses and the town goes bankrupt, so Homer decides to form a militia, and Lisa says, but Dad, if you're the police, who's going to police the police? And he says, Coast Guard? That if, somebody gets to kill with immunity, who kills the killers, or who reins in the killers, who polices the police? And of course, that's left-wing Lisa Simpson very much saying that, and I am here in Berserkly Town, and I am a little bit of a lefty-lefty, and occasionally a prickly pear like Hobbes and Sun Tzu, but leaving all this aside, and actually knowing how different demographics of people wanting and not wanting cops more and less in their lives is complicated, and I know this from teaching a multicultural classroom, and much love to everyone, everyone's families, and everyone dealing with all kinds of issues. I have much more I could say, of course, about policing in America, etc. I am not on a soapbox right here about politics. I am teaching you the basics of ideas for a whole classroom full of different people. So aside from that, though, it is very true to talk about the brutal issues and the brutality. why would the police not really be so policed and you have to give them kind of a pass? The civilization answer for many years and still is, and I just point out the human similarities across ye old civilization. That Hobbes in Britain, 2,000 years later, like Xunzi a little bit less than that, maybe about 1,800 years later, in Britain, basically says, look, you need a guy. You know, when the boss says push a button on a guy, I push a button. You know, the senator says, you see human kill people? Yeah. You know, who's this jerk? People get killed. Somebody has to do the killing. That person can't really be held in check is the argument. That's not checks and balances. Locke comes along after Hobbes and says, we need checks and balances against this kind of thing. And Americans are like, checks and balances are nice words in English, aren't they? I think they are. Locke is a nice guy. So I have already stuff on that on Locke up, but I'm not doing social political philosophy much as class-wise. I'm doing Greek, Asian, modern stuff, which is all good. And I do I'm not the political guy, but I know enough about it that in Confucianism, you have to be a bit political. And I teach a lot of this stuff in social political philosophy when I do get to teach it. But in the classes, definitely this is ethics and this is politics and this is definitely the Hobbes argument where somebody gets to be the police and there is no police of police. Whether or not we have citizen committees or checks and balances on that practice, that would be describing the bones of the bones in the marrow, as the Zen say, of what's all going on here and not. So, with all of that, of course, and continuing onward, with all kinds of talk to have about that in different ways, Xunzi is also a bit, like Confucians are, somewhat the pragmatist. He does not, like Confucius says, I don't have a hardlining prescription entirely dogmatically for anything. You always have to use discretion. Mencius says, not hardlining law. Protect the law, use discretion, but don't just follow the law or save your sister-in-law from drowning. Xunzi says that laws, morals, and rulers, even more extremely, are tools to be used for the cultivation and happiness of people. It is this part of his philosophy which may well have been supported plenty by the legalist and most brutally a little bit more than Epicurus might have in the happiness. So, in Improving Yourself, section 2 of the Xunzi, he argues that if we stick to the rituals and laws, our behavior will be good. And if we abandon the rituals and laws, which here again, tradition, culture, the ye old establishment, the way that culture is established and cultural as opposed to countercultural. If we abandon the culture and become entirely Taoist countercultural hippies, it will be bad. He draws openly on the behavior of civilized nobles versus the behavior of poor country folk to back this up. Now, this actually, Confucius says, a bumpkin asked me a question. Even the uneducated folks. Filth! That, he says, no, even these people are legit. You can't stop them from freely thinking. The guy asked me a question. He's uneducated, which Confucius does not praise, does not say go be an uneducated bum or Taoist. He does not say or a bumpkin and just be that, but takes all kinds. And Confucius wants the farmers in the countryside to be happy. So Confucius is a bit dissing children and is kind of like, well, this bumpkin, this uneducated fool, asks me a question, which is a little bit classist, and then Xunzi likes that kind of classism, thinks we should support the nobles, there are betters, but also, like Confucius, if these are jerk nobles, well, guess what you do with all of that? Of course, Confucius quite says, not entirely, but does plenty, quite literally. So, he says, look at the child and the educated, and the adult, look at the nobles versus the bumpkins and the hicks. Well, check it out. Education is good for you. I don't entirely think that, yeesh, but there's plenty of human beings who have said that. They believe it. There's plenty of that. There's truth in positions, and so I teach the controversy. It is city mouse, country mouse a bit, and that has been in my life a bit. So yes, he Xunzi is a city mouse, and he is a city boy like myself, and he definitely thinks, well, be like the city, not like the countryside, my dear. And yes, it's a bit elitist as heck, and Confucianism is a bit elitist, would be accused of that by Taoists who want to be bums who are wise and flip you off with both hands. I won't hear that. Yeah, like I described my eye rolls. Would you like to see my collection of off-color Italian hand gestures? Yeah, people are wolf girl evil. Stay in the city, get educated, don't be a rough redneck bumpkin. Is consistently Confucian. My apologies, because it is, again, city mouse, country mouse, kind of crap. But mouse poop. Xunzi draws a similar distinction between children's, have you met a child? Mencius, and adults. Clearly, Xunzi is a city guy who likes adults and is not much the parenting type. While Taoists saw the common country people as exemplary of virtue, Xunzi sees them as coarse and uncultured. As an aside, this strangely is like the civilized barbarian view versus, of course, Southeast Asia and other places the Chinese have, and plenty have, for thousands of years. As well as, I often do mention, there is a bit of a city mouse, country mouse thing with Cantonese and Mandarin. And I leave that where it is because I've actually had more than one Chinese student from China look at me a little weird as if I was trying to say something a bit harsher than that, but I am not. It is known, of course, Cantonese is a little bit of the city talk, educated. Mandarin is a little bit of the countryside, uneducated in China. Yet, I have actually had more than one Chinese student be like, well, it's not really like that. And so here, I'm not exactly sure what I said, where it's not really like that other than it's like that and it's not really like that. And I would talk, of course, to Chinese folks about Cantonese and Mandarin. That was what I understood from the folks who are more Cantonese folks out here, California. But as folks from China are coming over taking my classes, hopefully watching these videos, etc., I must admit, of course, I soak up what culture I can. And it's my understanding that Cantonese stuff is kind of Hong Kong, kind of the folks who make it over here plenty often and are kind of seeing themselves as city folk versus the Mandarin country folk. So, that said, though, I don't labor that point. I simply say you do know that this is human culture. Plenty all over the world you see these angles. And I often like, and I will not labor, when talking about racism and racial stereotypes, people very much think the down and out like rednecks and other down and out people in all walks of life in America are loud and expressive and passionate, whereas the civilized are psychologists tell us that polite, wealthy people often, not if they're golden toilet happy, actually. That's really weird new money showing off, kind of, or a spoiled kid. But if they basically are, that you would find old power and money is often very quiet and nice and discreet. Whereas in a certain sense, the uneducated and the uncouth are supposed to be loud and abrasive. That is not how I want to couch or contrast Cantonese culture with anything. But that is actually what you find people saying of educated, wealthy, civilized places versus the country bumpkins. Yes, you do. And psychologists tell us this. You do see this in this stuff. A little, not so much modern forms, I am saying. Much more, again, because modern China is not my specialty. What you do see here is a little city mouse, country mouse, well, the uncouth, the countryside, which does feature into American racism, something fierce. And with that, I, of course, leave that to other talks because I'm not going to get into, I love anti-racism. I'm not going to get all into that. That's how I do like teaching, though, a bunch of Chinese philosophy getting into these angles and just saying, notice the human angles here, right? I don't need you to agree with any of this or me. Maybe you hate me, that's fine. Just listen to some of this, though. Again, she's sexual, she's violent, she's wolf girl. So Xunzi argues that one's temperament and intelligence need to be in balance, and if they can get overgrown, they will cause ruin. This is very much in line with the doctrine of the mean or middle way found in the Analects and the Xunzi text. They talk about it, and it is the Book of the Rights, as already at the talk. Human abilities need to be reined in by society and customs, or they will cause problems. Xunzi argues that only by following laws can one be liberal and compassionate. Notice, that is very much thinking without learning without thinking of Confucius, and I do love the quote, and I have to slow down so I get it right. Learning without thinking is useless. Don't be a useless dogmatist and uselessly conservative without opening your mind. But thinking without learning is dangerous. Don't be a dangerous, open-minded hippie Taoist. So actually being too liberal is dangerous for these more conservative guys. Being too close-minded conservative is stupid, useless. So it's better, though, to be useless in a certain sense. Well, not for Nietzsche, but for these guys, it would be better to be useless than dangerous, even though. So you can see that Xunzi does not actually want us to be too liberal, because that would be too Taoist, letting your hair down too much. Yes. And that, of course, is not following the strict laws and being too liberal and compassionate. That opens the gates too much. What is it, buddy? Speaking of which, my cat has opened his mouth and is a-roaring. He's a tiny lion and a little Leo. Compassion is the goal. That is possible, but it cannot be achieved without laws and principles. What is it, pal? He wants actually me to, I have a blanket, and he wants to play under the blanket against the wall. But it isn't that time yet, and we have to rein in and restrain our cats and desires. Speaking of which... Hey, buddy. Come here. Hey, buddy. What is it, sweetheart? What is it? Yes. Pardon again. I have to rein in the cat. What do you think? Hey, buddy. Do you have anything to say? The silence of the night. BFFs for life. From the Kierkegaard thing. You are such a good guy. You're such a loving cat. As in The Simpsons. No one who speaks German can be an evil man. You know. Hey, buddy. So, anywho's, let's get on here. We only have a little bit more of Sunset to do. We're already on the half-hour mark, and I'm trying to keep this stuff down to about 45 if I can. That's the mouse, pal. Anywho's, so, we need to rein in the cats. Yes, he's finding toys to play with, and he wants to play. So yes, I only encourage this. And then yes. So, following your parents and teachers is necessary for human development. Remember, Mencius actually says following them after they're dead is amazing, because then they're not, and I mentioned Sun Tzu there. Confucius says in the Analects that learning without thinking is bad, but thinking without learning is dangerous, and Sun Tzu is very likely thinking of that passion in particular. Thinking of that passage and human passions in particular. Forgive me. In Man's Nature is Evil, it's a heck of an essay in ancient China. Section 23 of the Sun Tzu is entitled Cats Are Amazing. It is actually not titled that, nor subtitled that at all, although my life is now subtitled that a bit in words and human passions. But in Man's Nature is Evil, which is an actual essay of ancient China of Sun Tzu, which is specifically Essay 23. He opens with the thesis and states, and it's good work, by the way, as a philosophy instructor, to open with your thesis. He opens with the thesis and states that all goodness is the result of growth and effort. People naturally desire, they must work and change to understand that they only get what they desire when they put their desires in check. Checks and balances, weirdly enough. And they only learn this through involvement with society and its laws. Checked downward, which is the more Hobbesian checks downward. Locke is actually arguing we need the nobles to have checks and balances and the rich guys against the king such that they don't get all of their property very much taken. He frames it as if it's everybody, but he's not talking about everybody. See the Locke stuff. So actually checks and balances downward is very assumed to be necessary. When we say checks and balances and mean it in an American way, we mean actually Locke's upward, and often for corporations, nobles, and the powers that be, a little bit more for the common person. But historically, upward checks and balances rather than merely the constant and common human checks of power and police and empire, downward on people, walls, etc. So he very much believes in checks and balances downward, but not so much upward, of course. And we only learn through this with society and its laws. Freud argued very similarly, and here I get to mention, again, really let my hair down, I get to mention the famous story here, which I honestly can tell you in clear conscience, because as a young undergrad at Cal, they gave us great books of Western civilization to read. It's again, as Gandhi says, be a great idea already. And one of those books, which I don't know if they keep teaching people, is a small book they had us buy. I still have a copy with a bunch of store stickers all over it from buying like a $5 copy back in the day of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontent. Now, what Freud actually argues, and I do paraphrase it, and I might be skipping a detail or two, what he actually argues in that book, which is I do like arguing about the basics of what is gender or masculine or feminine behavior, because I do like psychoanalysis and then moving more to Gestalt kind of interpretation of behaviorism with Wittgenstein. I love that stuff. So in arguing about what is male, what is female, is any of that like legit, not... Which are hard questions to ask. Let's just leave that and gender right here, because I'm not getting actually into gender in this talk, but I do intend on getting into that in an egalitarian and anti-misogynistic and most happy way for, I hope, the most amount of individualistic people. Yes? So, with all of that, and my sort of aim to open up this stuff for the average person, not close it down or tick anybody entirely off, piss off our inner wolf girl, Freud actually stops kind of what he's doing because he's about to ruin, and he suddenly has a 2-page footnote in the opening pages of his Civilization and Discontent. I don't know when or how he added that, or what point in the process of his art, or his artistic process, but he stops and he says a 2-page footnote where you turn the page and suddenly there's like 2 pages of footnote in the printing that I have of that work. And it goes on and on about how Freud actually does put forward the theory in the footnote, tentatively, that he believes that ancient cavemen, not women, women are kind of walking hissy fits of emptiness for Freud, where they need they're constantly like the other as empty, and they need men in their lives to give them structure in their life for Freud in ways that I'm not going to explain to you right now. Up the insurance rates, again, in your place of business. So with all of that kind of stuff, Freud very much thinks that, well, who was the first man who made culture and developed civilization and technology? Freud actually argues in Civilization and its Discontent, not as a main point, but in the footnote, that the first man that often, Freud actually argues, lightning would strike the ground and there would be fire. The original fire, and Freud is very much arguing fire is the original Promethean, and that's where the Prometheus myth, he would be arguing, come from. Fire and other cultures, fire myths, yes, that are similar to Prometheus at all for Young, Campbell, other people. That fire is the first form of technology we tamed, the most primitive and useful of sort of energy things. Now notice Freud is talking about taming the passions and the heart and the pantaloons a bit, like Xunzi is, yes, most brutally in Old World. So what do we have here in cave people territory? Well, what happens is Freud actually argues, and it's a process a la Hegel, that the first man, not woman, because they're just walking hissy fits who can't put together, I guess, thought on their own, the little missies, is that, in most misogynistically, not me, that Freud basically says, well, the first man to come out and see fire would have, of course, as we know, sexually have pissed it out, is what he says. He's like, people were just peeing out fire left and right. I do love, if you haven't seen the very silly, obscene Professor Brothers, and the one, they didn't make many of those, but the one that they made, which I love that's hilarious, is, of course, the Sodom and Gomorrah one that is famous from the early YouTube internet, was people doing surreal comics. I did find it inspiring. And there's a professor guy who's lecturing about Sodom and Gomorrah and telling them all of what the story. And he's like, people were having sex with fire, and you see like just somebody's bare rump in the bad cartoon hand drawn, and this guy's just boning a fire, and it's like, I'm pretty sure you're gonna get burned, dude. Don't do that, kids. Don't have sex or drugs that way, you know. But of course, it's Sodom and Gomorrah is portrayed as just crazy orgies, so it's like, people were having sex with fire, man. Notice, of course, how hilarious, it's a bit of a silly joke, forgive me. We're talking about Xunzi and Freud, though. So the first guy to not bone the fire, which Freud, I actually think it's like whomever wrote the joke, if they're already Professor Joe, brothers jokes, Professor jokes, yes, haha, super dad jokes, edumacated. Reining it in, though, keeping it all together, as it were, Freud actually argues, and I think whoever wrote the bit about peeing fire out, boning fire, actually, and then refraining, no, I'm not going to have sex with this fire, is that actually Freud, and I always love to joke, and I have for years, it's like, don't you think there'd be a lot more fire-peeing websites out there if we had a primordial desire to pee fire out? Like, let's not talk about the whole range of what's out there online, kids, but given all of that and the crazy spectrum of clear projection of human desires and other things, why would there not be a projection of urine at the fire websites real popular with the kids, like, this is hot, No, I don't know that this is so real. It's again, this is not one of Freud's most popular ideas enduring, but he actually is giving us, and that is why I rant and rave about Wolf Girl and then fire peeing, and not so many websites, is if you think about the internet and what is and isn't displayed a whole lot, yeesh, online, people clearly have desires, they clearly rein them in, keep them indoors online, they keep them in their pantaloons, and then they go out, and then they like watching the fire online a bit, children. Hopefully, my videos here. But since all of this is before our time, we were kind of thrown into all this a la the Heideggers, is that Freud is basically saying after Nietzsche and Heidegger and a bunch of other German actually around the same time as Heidegger with his later thinking, actually, not, and people go back and forth wondering how Heideggerian is Freud or not, a little bit. Freud basically is like, yeah, no, Sun Tzu's right, except he doesn't say Sun Tzu's right. We are this crazy caveman ball of a pile of seething weasels, as I say with Schopenhauer, who was a very similar prickly pear to all of this, and proto-Freudian in his ideas, and probably uninfluenced, Freud has been accused of ripping off Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. A little bit less Heidegger because he's right at the same time. But that we have this crazy heart of fire, we need it kicked in by, I gave the pinata story. I will, actually, it is appropriate to give the pinata story again very briefly here. We are not yet encroaching on the 45 mark. That back in the day when I was like 3 or 4, I was at a party. I had a friend. She was American and half Korean and half Chinese, and had a piñata at her birthday party. I thus associate this in most bigoted ways, piñatas, with Korean and half Korean culture. You know which half, the better half, right? So basically, with all of my jokes and things, I saw that she had this piñata leg, and I had this moment where I just grabbed for the piñata leg. And she went, and pulled it back. And she and I had never sort of had a negative moment. I'm a 3-year-old. I'm an idiot. So actually that was sort of this moment of guilt where I was like, oh God, I just tried to grab something from somebody else. Freud and Piaget and all these other psychologists would say we have moments as children where we realize guilt or shame or something. We come up and our desires hits somebody else's desires, and we have to be kind of kicked in and reined in order to develop as people. Whether or not you like Mencius or Sun Tzu more, there's a bit of Freud and Piaget in that story of the piñata leg. I feel shame, and I'm like, oh God, moment of self-consciousness, moment of ego, superego. It's the id encountering others, and then it turns into superego and negotiates the ego in between them. For Freud, I'm not saying I am into that model, but if there is anything like developing the superego, and I would say in psychology today, there is something like developing in you the Freudian superego or egos a bit, but it's not in vogue, of course, to say the id, the superego, etc. What you see all here, of course, and what I'm describing with a bunch of obscenity with fire peeing, Freud actually in the late 1800s and early 1900s advanced, I think in the earliest of 1900s, not about 100 years ago, advanced the theory very much like Sun Tzu's, and it's a sexual violence theory as to how man created technology and thus civilization. To sum up all of this awfulness here, is that it actually is a la the piñata leg, and then fire in weird ways. Man, not woman, learned to rein it in, keep it in the fur pantaloons and the shorts, and then that's where technology and civilization comes from. Civilization and its discontent is the name of the book. So how did all this get to where it is what Freud is calling it, and he puts the origin as a speculative theory about fire peeing in the 2-page footnote. I find that amazing. Otherwise, I wouldn't talk so much about it and joke in these horrifying ways. So, on back to Sun Tzu again, although that all is modern Sun Tzu 100 years ago in a lot of weird ways, which is amazing because we have common forms of life and general human culture like the Chinese, and so we would think a lot like everyone. I would argue with all sorts of exceptions and overlappings of boundaries is often my Wittgensteinian global human culture generalistic perspective. So Sun Tzu openly refers to Mencius by name and his theory that human nature is good and says Mencius is wrong. Human nature is not good. Human nature is originally, before transmutation, evil. Sun Tzu argues that Mencius is confusing human nature with the results of conscious human activity and development. I mentioned with Mencius, there is a little, the guy from Death Stranding who's crying on the beach. There's a great image of him crying and a little girl trying to feed him a snack on the TV. What Sun Tzu would say, if Mencius pointed to that little girl, who again I believe is in Korea, like trying to feed Korean snack to crying man, is that this little girl has already received good parenting. If she had no parents in her life, this little girl would not feed anyone a snack. The only reason, Sun Tzu would argue, and here Mencius would say no, because of the good is motivated why she imitates her parents. Sun Tzu would say the only reason this child is not punching the TV or just drooling and is trying to feed a snack to the man with concern is because she has already had good parenting. Good parenting, again, if she studies very hard, she can be a doctor or a lawyer. So, again, Kung Fu Hustle, instant Chinese dad, I must be. And talk like Yoda, again, I do not. So, some argue, again, how could, and there is a problem here, actually a good problem here we could call the problem of Sun Tzu and the ancient sage kings. We have here a problem, though. How do you get originally good Chinese dad down the infinite regress, right? We're trying to have good bearded Chinese dad and good bearded emperor, right? I speak in silly ways to you, most lovingly. So how the heck do we have conservative Chinese dad who says if you study very hard, you can be a doctor or a lawyer, a la Kung Fu Hustle, if human nature is evil? Well, if we're not doing fire peeing theory here, where the heck does the original Sage King come from? That's a problem. Where do they look to? They look to other sages? There aren't any. Where do they look to their parents? Their parents are not the Sage Kings. How the heck do they get morals into themselves originally? Of course, assuming probably he would have to say, well, the Sage Kings had decent enough parenting. But where did the parents get it from? The parents get it from the original humanity and the Adam and Eve of China here. How are we doing this? Well, essentially, Xunzi does seem to anticipate this, and because he's argued with people, he does reply, and this is, again, anticipate your opponent in a philosophical argument. He replies, given that argument is about talking to people and trying to negotiate, is that he says, with the negotiations, that the Sage Kings clearly had reached a level already where they had gotten stuff together, but originally where this all comes from is not from the fire, yeesh, is from looking to the cosmos. Now that actually does weirdly fit with lightning strikes and there's fire. Originally, Xunzi, like Mozi argues, we get everything from the birds and the beasts. We soak up nature. So by soaking up nature and learning how to have clothes and weapons from nature, we are looking at the order of the cosmos. This is an intelligent design theory, of course, and we see the order of the gods, our super dads. Aristotle argues, you're not supposed to kill your father, and you certainly aren't as a Confucian, but if your super dad, the gods, as they do for the Triboli, he just assumes polytheistic gods are probably real for other people too. If your super dad says kill your dad, this is in his work on logic, Aristotle argues, well, if the polytheistic gods say kill your father, you gotta kill your father. That's logic, kids. And it is, given its cultural frame, most brutally. Not like people think of Aristotle most stupidly, as if he wasn't serious about gods. He liked logic. All of that, though. So, as with this stuff in China, and constantly relativizing this stuff on purpose, you basically have Xunzi saying, well, they looked outward to the gods and the cosmos and how beautiful it was and organized. So you have to assume that super dads are out there in a certain sense, and then if you do, that's where the infinite regress halts. And then, of course, where the gods come from is theological concerns and all of that. So while Mencius teaches to look inside ourselves to find morality, Xunzi is consistently looking outside ourselves to both society and the cosmos. So maybe Wolf Girl could have learned to feed Sad Man a snack on the TVs if actually she just looks to the cosmos as Wolf Girl on the desert island with Ibn Tufayil's Proto-Robinson Crusoe Guy Friday. The Muslims and Christians are thinking about the savage very much, noble or not. And maybe the noble savage just looks to, as Muslims and Christians wrote about for the last 1,000 years, maybe they look to the desert island and the purity there rather than the beach ball with the smiley face drawn on it. So the Sage King looks outside of themselves, not only to great texts and social arrangements, but to the order of the universe to develop themselves. Xunzi is more cosmological than both Confucius and Mencius, speaking of the orders of nature and base, but can potentially speaking of the orders of nature as base, but they can potentially develop to be great like a society or the cosmos. In one passage, Xunzi argues that fire and water have energy. Thankfully, he doesn't say anything else here, Freudian, but no awareness. He actually thinks they're, in a certain sense, full of living energy, but they don't know that they're alive, fire and water. He says this. I love old school physics in philosophy. But humans have energy, awareness, and the capacity to develop discrimination of right and wrong and morality. Again, I love Schopenhauer in the early 1800s thinks crystals are halfway between rocks and plants and argues this at a time when people just straight up were speculating and did not know. In the early 1800s, they developed this. Human beings, by looking outward at crystals, rocks, plants, otherwise, and learning, not by looking inward, which will only stunt growth and keep us in an immature and desirous state. I have to say, I really have a more positive view of human nature than Xunzi. But actually, instead of navel-gazing, I love Taoism and Buddhism and Zen. I think Zen does say to their fellow Buddhists, rather than navel-gaze, why not just look at the situation you're in and realize how amazing it is. So I actually do like this thought, but in other thinkers, and the Zen like being brutal with our wolf-like nature. It is making distinctions that makes us greater than beasts, Xunzi argues, as Aristotle would, and the rituals and traditions that are the greatest distinctions passed down from the sage kings. Xunzi argues that the example of childlike love Mencius employs is misleading. Children do not know enough and are not developed enough to refrain from grabbing for themselves. Good people restrain their own desires to become good to others, unlike the child. Note that we tell people to be like a child, I mentioned with Mencius, but we also tell people not to be like a child. When children are innocent, happy, and adorable, they are the pure amazing. Whenever they start to whine, they are the most undisciplined, of course, and the horrible to put up with. As an aside, I actually do think it is sad when people get on a plane. I have had a couple in my life say, oh, we were that person on the plane with their crying child, having sadness in the ears and the temperament with the pressure drop, etc. Speaking of which, Toots from Toots and the Maytals passed in September, last September due to COVID in Jamaica, it is suspected. I did not know that until the other day. Much love, and Toots is the guy who invented the term reggae, possibly. And again, he passed from, COVID possibly and complications in Jamaica. Was a really loving, amazing guy, and one of the world's greatest, most foundational reggae musicians ever. My dad had Toots records back in the day. I do have collected his music. Think he's one of the most amazing dudes. So, I didn't know he had passed again until the other day. And that was, yes. But anyway, just have to mention that with the pressure drop, of course, and all of that. Pressure is going to drop on you continuously, as with all of this. Mic and needle drop, as in drop that and back on with the stuff. So, Xunzi argues that greatness is an object of desire, to be great as a target for the archer, and the great person desires to overcome desire. That's very Freud. It is very Freud to say that all of civilization is tucking it into your pants and thus going and becoming an accountant, what we know as delayed gratification. This is very much, now they have been redoing psych experiments like the marshmallow cookie experiment where you make kids cruelly sit in a room and stare at a cookie or a marshmallow, as is famous in psychology. My sister and my favorite is there's a little girl, they put it like a marshmallow on a plate, and she sits on her hands staring at it. This one boy, apparently, he picks up the marshmallow, shoves it into his mouth, and then freaks out and puts it back on the plate, like you're supposed to not, eat the marshmallow. We'll give you 2 marshmallows or cookies. And children have little strategies, and they do find that children who have better strategies then are better at, often, not always, better at becoming more disciplined, getting better jobs, other things if they're better at sitting on their hands and not eating the marshmallow, or looking the other way back at the marshmallow, looking away again, sad, needs snack, in TV. So, with a marshmallow, thunk, basically, with all of that, you kind of have delayed gratification. And basically, this is all about if you can delay gratification, you become a more civilized, better disciplined human being. That's basically the idea here. Again, psychologists call it delayed gratification and how that is contributive to being a disciplined, productive person. So, the achievements satisfy the person more than the initial lesser thing desired would be the idea. So, Xunzi is saying, put development as your desire, you will transmute desire from the baser things. I haven't seen a person who doesn't want sex more than scholarship, according to Confucius. Twice he says, you turn that into sexual desire, into being an accountant and scholarship for both Xunzi and Freud. And it seems Confucius. If Mencius is right, Xunzi argues, we could dispense with society and be good in the state of nature. Both the Taoist and Rousseau, the European political philosopher, hold this to be true. Xunzi is arguing that if we believe Mencius, we may as well all become Taoists. If we honor the sages and the good over the stupid and the evil, we do so because of how much each has developed and not because of their universal nature. Originally, as just itself, without development. Xunzi is arguing that if we believe Mencius, we may as well all become Moists. And oppositely, Xunzi argues that all human beings are equal in their capacity to become good and develop. But they do not start out good. The sage is the one who develops, not the one who remains the same as if they were in the beginning. Xunzi argues, and I have mentioned already, I love the idea and the image, because one has 2 feet, you can theoretically walk, anyone can become a Yao or a Shun, or can walk to the ends of the earth. This sort of assumes almost a flat earth ancient theory, of course. But no one so far has managed to walk to the ends of the earth, possibly because there ain't no flat earth. But the famous bows for arrows, he says, this is also ancient kind of Chinese speak here. The famous bows, the most famous of bows that have like legendary names in the video games. The most famous bows for arrows, the most famous leaders and horses, the most famous horses, Seabiscuit, all became famous for how they were cultivated and developed, like you were developing the bow through like Fletcher, like bow craft stuff, and taming the horses. Hold your horses back. None of these, bows, leaders, or horses, were excellent without conscious effort and process. He ends by saying twice, environment is the important thing. Remember, Mencius agrees in speaking of sowing barley. For the Confucian society is essential. The debate is on whether environment complements or contradicts, or both, human nature. Two sides of the same coin. In one last passage I want to cite, again, I do like quoting this paragraph because it is very much Xunzi talking about sort of scientific method loosely, and I do want to say that's how human beings figure things out, and I am somebody to push the more pragmatic point of view. The scientific method is really just the refined practices of the human, and civilizations tend to do some science. So pushing it beyond just ideas that it is just Western science or has Western principles in science, and saying human beings across in Egypt and China clearly did things plenty scientifically, otherwise they would have collapsed. And just lovingly and openly saying that. But people really take sides here. So I do have to quote this at length, just because I do want people to appreciate Chinese thought as well as Hawaiian thought, Indian thought, and understand it's all very human, which is why I quote this paragraph at length. It is still hard to find any Indian philosophy taught, and you can very much hear human thought in Indian philosophy, like yours, which you don't know until you're exposed to it. And the same is true. We're having more Chinese philosophy in people's lives, but people still find it hard to get. So I want people to understand whatever you think about modern China and power and war and everything in the world. And you should probably understand these people are amazingly human. Back in the day, ancient Chinese thought is good thought for everyone. So, given that and what people often say about Europeans or Greek thought being the original human thought and scientific, which I do not like and constantly press against, let me just quote this passage of Xunzi at the end here. Those who are good at discussing antiquity, ancient times, must demonstrate the validity of what they are saying in modern times, current times, ancient China. Those who are good at discussing the way of things, the heavens, where nature comes from in physics, must show proofs from the human world. In discussions of all kinds, men value what is in accord with the facts, agreements, and what can be proved to be valid. Hence, if a man sits on his mat propounding some theory, he should be able to stand right up and put it into practice. That's the proof in the pudding for the pragmatist. And show that it can be extended over a wide area, generally, perhaps not universally, always without exception, with equal validity, generally. Now, Mencius states that man's nature is good, but this is neither in accord with the facts, nor can it be proved to be valid. That would be empiricism and rationalism both, very much. It is not inductive or deductive. Neither way, what Mencius is saying validly. That is, again, a human being wrestling with the human mind and psychology, as we do. It pains me all the time to hear people say, that's Greek or scientific reasoning. I do have people like, wow, that one guy in China happened to think like a Greek person. No. You know, let me just lovingly say, without telling you everything all at once, listen to my talks and you will consistently hear me present the evidence in the passages, such that this is all very human, whether or not you and I do or disagree with the angles, which I love particularly, even though Xunzi is not my dude. I really love getting into detail on this stuff. I knew I would take most of, if not the whole hour. Because, yeah, this is amazing stuff. It's very proto-Freud, and I do love Freud and specifically post-Freudian thought, saying, well, Gestalt-wise, how do we get some of, but over a bit of Freud? So, with all of that, whether or not we want to pee fire out, yeesh. Again, much love to your inner wolf girl of the pleasant and quiet kind. And, as with all of this stuff, hopefully you didn't find that too upsetting, and I will merrily and happily see ya, if and when I ever see ya.